And welcome back to our Inland Housing Summit for 2021 and to our final session, session 4 on future outlooks. And we're going to look at challenging the norm through this session. A reminder that you can ask questions by typing them into the question box, and you'll see that in the right-hand bottom corner of your screen. For most of the sessions today, we will reserve questions for the end. There is an exception though in this session. Garry Feilding, who's the New South Wales Regional Housing Taskforce Chair, is with us as the first speaker. He's got to run, he's got a lot of things to do. So for this session and this session only, if you've got questions for Garry, we will address them to him after he's finished speaking shortly. But please enter those questions as you think of them. You can also upvote questions that other people have entered, and I've got them in front of me so I can see what's popular, what's trending, and I'm trying to get to as many of them as I can and amalgamate them as much as possible. We also really encourage you to share your thoughts during the day on your social media, and the hashtags are IGS Housing 21, hashtag RDA Orana, hashtag RDA Riverina, and that means that we can reshare your content and help push that conversation along. Now, I mentioned our sponsors, and our sponsor for this section is the Committee for Wagga. RDA Riverina is obviously in the midst of Wagga, and we've heard a lot of references today to that vibrant regional economy that Orana also shares. So thanks to them for their help, their support, and their participation. And I think we've got some images to roll now, Adam. And you can see the Committee for Wagga there is pretty young and pretty energised, and there is a lot going on in Wagga. Obviously images there from Kapuka as well, the fireworks. It's a really vibrant regional centre, and wonderful to see the amount of growth that's predicted there. I think it's expected there'll be 100,000 people in Wagga within the next 30 to 40 years or so. So let's go now to our session 4 Future Outlook, Challenging the Norm. And our first speaker is Garry Feilding. He's a qualified town planner with over 40 years experience in state and local government and the private sector. He's worked at senior executive levels within the New South Wales Department of Planning and also as head planner with the Newcastle, Woollahra and Maitland councils. He is a Life Fellow and former New South Wales President of the Planning Institute of Australia and the state-appointed chair of the Western Regional Planning Panel. Garry, a very good afternoon to you.
Well, good afternoon, Genevieve, and thank you for the welcome. As you pointed out, I'm the chair of the Regional Housing Task Force established by the New South Wales Government, and I certainly am very pleased to have the opportunity to address this summit today. What I'd like to do is share with you some information about the Regional Housing Task Force and to present some of the task force's initial findings on the barriers to delivering housing in the regions. I'll spend some time going through some background to the Regional Housing Task Force and how it came about and what its focus is. I'll just go through these slides. I'm sure you're all keenly aware of the growing housing pressures facing regional New South Wales, particularly in the wake of the COVID pandemic. The task force has been established by Minister Rob Stokes, the Minister for Planning and Public Spaces, in response to these pressures. The task force has the role of identifying the barriers in the planning system and providing recommendations about how to speed up the delivery of homes in regional New South Wales. Importantly, and this is something some of the participants I'm sure will be interested in, we'll build on the evidence gathered as part of the New South Wales Housing Strategy of 2041, which was released in March of this year, and we'll focus on the solutions, and our solutions will align with the 4 key pillars of the strategy, that is supply, affordability, diversity, and resilience when it comes to housing. The task force, apart from myself as chair, is also made up of 3 senior executive directors from the Department of Planning, industry and environment, and also a senior executive of the Department of Regional New South Wales. So that's the makeup of the task force that the Minister has established. The task force is consulting with key stakeholders from councils, industry and community groups to identify the constraints to housing supply, diversity and affordability in the regions. We'll be looking at the obstacles in the planning system preventing new housing being brought to market in the regions, and solutions that have the potential to boost supply and encourage greater housing choice in the regions. It's recognised that housing outcomes are driven by a complex mix of factors, many of which sit outside of the planning system. But although the task force is more closely focused on the planning system, we'll be collecting insights into the broader drivers of housing outcomes in regional markets, and will then feed those into the implementation of the housing strategy via the government's expert housing advisory panel. As I intimated earlier, the primary focus of the task force is on solutions within the planning system, within the New South Wales planning system, and other government levers to stimulate housing supply and remove impediments to providing housing that is then affordable and matched to community needs. In the lead up to the establishment of the task force, there was a good deal of preliminary work undertaken to identify housing issues and also trends in regional communities. And in doing that, we brought together a range of demographic and economic indicators along with more qualitative information, such as reviewing local housing strategies and strategic planning documents. The task force is building on this evidence base by engaging with a wide range of stakeholders to gather their views and insights. We'll compile all that we hear from stakeholders and closely consider their submissions and representations in the preparation of our task force report. The report will contain recommendations to the New South Wales Government, detailing our findings, and it will recommend solutions to encourage greater housing choice, supply and affordability in regional New South Wales. The report is due in October for consideration by Minister Stokes. During, all of August, and indeed this commenced towards the end of July, we've been undertaking an extensive listening exercise, conducting a series of meetings with stakeholders and community groups to understand the issues of housing affordability and housing supply in the regions. We've already held 4 virtual roundtables with local councils, local Aboriginal land councils, community housing providers, the development and construction industry, and members of the general public. There have been, I think in excess of 300 participants in those 4 virtual roundtables. Some of you, I understand, may have attended one or other of those roundtables, and for those that have, I certainly thank you for doing so. We're planning to hold in-person roundtables, or we were intending to hold in-person roundtables in various regional locations, but in the light of the current COVID restrictions, we are now shifting instead to online meetings that will be held throughout all of next week. there'll be something like 7 or 8 of those round tables held next week. And these meetings will be targeted at specific regions, for example, the southeastern tablelands and the Hunter and Central Coast. You can view the schedule of events on the planning portal, and we really encourage attendance from those people participating in this Inland Growth Summit to one or more of those round tables, please. The participants in this summit are invited to make a formal submission to the task force via the planning portal page. And some of you would be aware already, I'm sure, but what we would like very much is to receive those submissions no later, please, than the 27th of August, Friday, the 27th of August. Okay, what I'd like to do now is take this opportunity to provide a brief overview of some of the findings of the task force up to this point in time. We recognise there are a broad range of housing supply issues impacting regional communities, and we also recognise that regional New South Wales is not homogenous. Housing issues vary greatly by region and between coastal and inland areas, and that has certainly been made very clear to us through responses to the roundtable sessions. Given just the short amount of time I've got today, I hope you'll forgive me for speaking generally about the issues raised with the task force to date. I'll first speak to the critical housing issues and then to some of the planning barriers that stakeholders have identified during our engagement with those stakeholders over the last few weeks. Okay, many stakeholders have raised rental shortages in the regions as a significant issue, significant housing and indeed a significant social and economic issue. And this is both in terms of affordability and availability of rental properties. Rental vacancies have been falling across regional New South Wales since June 2020. Rental markets with a rental vacancy rate of 3% are generally considered to be well balanced between supply and demand, and that's been the sort of yardstick that's been used for many, many years when it comes to rental vacancy rates. But currently, no regional local government area has a vacancy rate above 3%. And some regional local government areas have vacancy rates close to 0%. So it's becoming a major issue, a major social and indeed economic issue for the regions. As I'm sure you'd be aware, this is having significant impacts on regional communities, with many households struggling to find appropriate accommodation, businesses struggling to attract workers, including required key workers. There's increasing rates of housing stress throughout the regions, and even some households being forced out of their communities altogether. Prior to COVID, rental vacancy rates were tight, but relatively steady across regional New South Wales. So COVID is certainly having quite an impact on the rental scene. What I should add just at this point too is that rental vacancies have clearly dropped across regional New South Wales, indicating changing patterns of demand. And these changing patterns of demand are likely driven by migration changes, not just in terms of people moving into the regions, from capital cities, for example, but people now staying in their regional communities. So we've got this sort of dual migration demand that is bringing about these pressures on housing demand in regional towns and cities. Other factors such as the increasing number of short-term rental housing listings and the impact of bushfires, flooding and temporary workers, including those working on major infrastructure projects, have all brought about competition for rental stock that is also contributing to these outcomes, the pressures on the rental housing market. From the community housing sector, we've heard that the limited availability of rental properties is impacting on their ability to provide emergency and crisis accommodation. So really growing social challenges there in those affected regional centres. Okay, just moving on to the next slide. These rapid changes in demand are certainly a challenge, as demand changes have been swift, but the pipeline of new housing is slow to respond, indeed very slow to respond. Outside of recent changes in demand, changing demographics in regional areas has already led to a mismatch in demand and supply, as most dwellings in regional New South Wales are detached houses and most have 3 bedrooms. Less than 10% of housing stock was 1-bedroom housing in 2016. Meanwhile, there's growing demand for smaller dwellings due to the rising number of lone person households and shrinking household size, again creating a mismatch in supply and demand of the various housing types. The ageing population in regional New South Wales is also placing pressure on regional housing markets, with growing demand for smaller and accessible dwellings. What I'd like to do now is speak to the barriers to new housing supply. Some stakeholders have identified the process of rezoning land to be a barrier to new housing supply, but a lot of stakeholders have identified that there is adequate land in many regional towns and centres that are zoned for housing development, and felt there was too much focus on unlocking new supply through further rezonings to accommodate housing. So there's been an interesting feedback during our engagement with the communities. In fact, there is existing theoretical housing supply in land zoned for housing that can't be unlocked due to difficulties during post-rezoning processes. The process of putting in a development application and then translating that development consent into new housing. So there's this sort of planning system issue that is certainly present and certainly identified as an issue in providing housing in a timely way. We've heard a lot about the need for coordination between state government agencies and the development and construction industries to bring about a pipeline of development, especially better coordination and rollout of critical infrastructure like water, sewerage and roads. Many stakeholders felt that the state government could play a bigger role in supporting new housing to market by coordinating infrastructure, such as through growth infrastructure plans. So that's certainly been impressed upon the task force to date. We've also heard of the difficulty of supplying regional markets with diverse housing, that is, housing of various sizes, price points, and targeted at specific demographics such as aged care housing, which I referred to just a moment ago. These types of housing were generally identified as being less feasible to develop due to market factors, but we've also heard about planning controls not being suitable to support the delivery of diverse housing in existing regional centres and towns. And that's been an important message that is coming through to us. We've heard about the complexity of the planning system, in particular, the need for better clarity around what information is needed to support a decision at the rezoning stage versus at the development application stage. There were concerns that there was duplication of studies or requirements for studies between rezoning, the rezoning stage, and the development consent stage or the development application stage. Through our engagement with stakeholders, we've also heard that it can be challenging balancing the needs of future residents and the need for affordable and more diverse housing with the expectations of the existing community. So there's this resistance to, if you like, urban change from the existing communities in regional centres to accommodate the changing demands for more affordable and more diverse housing. Due to just the limited time I have today, I might, Genevieve, just leave it there, but I'd really like to invite any questions or indeed comments on what our findings to date have been. Again, there's that opportunity which I strongly encourage for people interested, and I'm sure all of you are interested in housing in regional New South Wales, to make submissions to the task force as well. But Genevieve, just over to you, please, to take or forward on to me any questions or comments at this stage.
I've got a couple of questions for you now, Garry, if I could go to you on
Please.
those. One of them saying that there was a terrific presentation, I'm not sure if you heard it, by Brendan Grills a little earlier on the role of the state in housing supply in Port Hedland. And he touched on just the dreadful outcome that an unfettered housing market had when everything collided together up in the northwest and Western Australia, and the role the government was then able to play when they stepped in and separated the housing supply from pure supply and demand. Is that something that you're thinking about taking on in New South Wales? Is that a model you might consider?
It's certainly a model we'll consider, Genevieve, without a doubt. Without a doubt. So we're looking at various models throughout Australia and indeed overseas as well.
Sorry, you are breaking up a little bit here. I hope that everyone else can hear you, Garry. Another question saying, with an emphasis on strategic planning to support planning proposals to facilitate rezoning, will more resources be provided to councils to finalise their studies?
Yes. The Department of Planning is keen to assist councils where, particularly those councils that are poorly resourced when it comes to strategic planning staff. So we're looking at how we can provide that strategic planning assistance to those councils. Can I say there are also, though, a number of councils in regional New South Wales that are quite well equipped with strategic planning skills and have produced some quite good strategic planning outcomes for their communities as well.
But I would certainly point to councils that we've heard of today that find themselves with mining booms and so on and so forth, and perhaps otherwise very small communities and small local government apparatus. Another question saying, will the Department of Planning or the Housing Task Force use this summit to inform their decisions? Are you listening to us, Garry?
Well, I do apologise for the fact that I couldn't join you until just after lunch, so I couldn't participate in the earlier part of the summit. But we will be provided with outcomes from this summit that we'll keenly consider, absolutely.
And just one or two other things very quickly. I know you need to move on. Is the task force able to recommend a better coordination of government infrastructure rollout in terms of timing and getting governments to work together? And a further comment saying the lack of planners and engineers in councils is quite a concern. And finally, I'll say to you, Fiona asks, would you consider developing a regional concierge service to assist in coordinating the implementation of the infrastructure boom and strategic planning? I think those questions are all connected. It's, can we get the coordination better between all levels of government?
Yes. No, well, the coordination between different agencies in government has been a point that's been raised a few times during the roundtables. And one of the sessions that we will be arranging either next week or the week after will be with the whole range of different government agencies to talk through that whole issue. But it's been, dare I say it, in my long career as a planner, an ongoing issue, and one that we certainly have to attend to, Genevieve. And you touched again on the resourcing with some councils, with engineers and planners, and the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment is already providing some assistance to those under-resourced councils when it comes to some of the regionally significant development, that councils have to prepare assessment reports on those applications that then come to regional planning panels. So the department's already assisting in that regard, but we need to look at how further assistance can be provided.
Garry, look, I know your time is short. We very much appreciate you being here. Thank you so much indeed for being with us.
Thank you, Genevieve. And can I please encourage participants to make submissions to the task force as I requested. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. And we do have the address for that up on the question screen, planningportal.nsw.gov.au, regional housing. And Garry Fielding is the chair of the New South Wales Regional Housing Task Force. We're going to hear next from David Fisher from Housing Plus. He's been their CEO since 2016, and he's championed the need for additional community services and more affordable housing across the central and far west regions of New South Wales. David's passionate about community-based organisation, the provision of opportunities and choices to tenants, and developing the culture and the impact of the organisation he leads. He's the Vice Chair of Homelessness New South Wales and President of NCOS boards, and he seeks always to provide a much-needed regional perspective to these organisations. He'll talk to us today about the role of community housing in addressing shortages. Welcome, David.
Good afternoon, Genevieve, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll just bring up my presentation now, I hope. Sorry about this, everyone. I did practice with the team and I can't seem to locate it at the moment. Sorry, say that again, please. Yep. Oh yeah, lovely. Thank you. I'll bring that up now. Jenny, can I just check? Can you see that?
Yes, we can see it. Thanks, David.
Lovely. Oh, well, look, thanks everyone. And thank you very much for inviting me to be able to contribute to today's discussion. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the lands that this meeting is taking place upon and pay my respects to Auntie Cheryl Penrith and her welcome to country earlier today and other First Nation people who may be in this meeting. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future. I'd like to talk to you and share with you some information on community housing providers, and my presentation is going to be about the purpose and opportunities that community housing providers provide, and then finish with some examples of that kind of collaboration in action. So if I maybe start by explaining a little bit about myself and Housing Plus. We're a regionally based, charitable, not-for-profit housing organisation. So we have, we're both a community housing provider as well as a community services provider. We currently manage over 1,100 properties in the central and far west of New South Wales. And we provide a range of community services, including homeless services. So we provide support to over 1,300 clients every year, and that in the Orange, Cabon, Blaney areas. And we're also, for the last 15 years, a provider of domestic family violence services. We provide the court advocacy services from pretty much Lithgow to Nyngan on the other side of Double. And our various DV services provide support to 15,000 women and children every year. And some of the issues that we've heard about today particularly affect those cohorts. I think our services, and I think this is the same for most community housing providers, is about finding somebody a home and providing support to keep them in that home, and in over time giving them support to become more independent. And community housing providers, as you no doubt know, represent about 69 community housing providers operate in New South Wales. They're all regulated under the National Regulatory System for Community Housing Providers, community housing. And that's really important because that regulatory regime makes sure that the organisations are all properly governed, that they're all properly managed, and that they're all viable. That's increasingly important as the sector is growing and is starting to increase its borrowing. And it's very important for government and other stakeholders to have confidence in the ability and capability of the sector. At the moment, I think in June this year, there was 51,000 properties under management by the community housing sector across the state. That represents more than a third of all social housing in the state. In terms of investment, since 2012, community housing providers have built 3,000 new properties in the state, borrowing $1.4 billion in the process to do that. So we're growing in capacity and growing in capability. Who do we provide housing for? I think it's really important just to maybe clarify a few things. We provide we're a very diverse sector, and it's one of our strengths that because we're locally based, we're much more tuned into the particular needs of that town or city. But broadly speaking, we provide accommodation for those who are very low or medium income. To put some figures onto that, that would be defined by New South Wales government as a single adult with $40,000 income up to a couple with 3 children who have got income of 101,000. That's the income eligibility criteria for affordable housing that the community housing sector provides. And I think the term affordable housing gets used in a lot of different places, in a lot of different ways. But it's important to note that when community housing is talking about affordable housing, they're talking about housing that's 20% below the market. So that's the group. It's that group who are under rental stress, which across the state represents 1.4 million people who are in some form of housing stress at the moment. In terms of the diversity, there is a whole range of different housing and organisations being formed to meet that, whether or not that's disability accommodation, aged care, specific accommodation for domestic family violence. We're at the moment, I've just opened the first in the state purpose-built core and cluster DV centre, and we're building 3 more in the region. There's Aboriginal community housing providers. Those organisations are specifically focused on meeting the needs of First Nation people. And importantly, the sector is increasingly providing accommodation to meet key and essential workers. So what's some of the benefits of working with a community housing provider? Well, I think it's important to remember that they are charitable. And as a charitable organisation, they don't pay GST, we don't pay land tax, we don't pay stamp duty. We are also, as a charitable organisation, able, I should say, to attract philanthropic donations. And I think one of the strengths of the sector is its ability to innovate and layer funding from different locations. So we're able to layer funding from local council, with state, with Commonwealth, as well as invest as ourselves against our assets. And that layering, that multiplier effect, has a real dividend for government and for other stakeholders. So, for example, New South Wales' recent Community Housing Innovation Fund, which was a $23 million fund, was able to leverage in from the community housing sector over 60 million. So it was a threefold increase for government, that particular programme. That layering is part of what community housing providers are very, very adept at. And some of the examples that I'll show later, and I think the speakers from my colleagues at Argyle will talk about later, shows that ability to work collaboratively and layer funding from different locations. I think the other things that define community housing providers is we have an integrated approach to property and tenancy management. We are here for the long term. Most of the community housing providers have been operating for almost 40 years now. So there's a long-term commitment to particular communities and particular towns and cities. And there's a real focus on sustaining tenancies. I think the other advantages of working with community housing providers is that local knowledge built up over time. We know where sites are, we know where the opportunities are, and we are tuned in to understanding what our community's needs are. And we're able to link housing to support services. It's really important that it's not just about the house, although critically important that is. The house is the foundation to then build upon education, employment, and deal with some health issues if that's the case as well. That's really important because what CHPs are trying to do is improve the housing system, that people who come in crisis accommodation move to secure social rented properties, then affordable, and then transition into the private rental market. And unfortunately, what we're seeing now is a kind of log jam of the system. There's not enough properties for people to move into in the first place. So I think that's community housing providers in a kind of snapshot and a little summary. And what we're very good at is working collaboratively. And I think I'd like just to say a few words now about how I believe community housing providers can work with government to improve the supply of housing. So that's about making sure that a land is available. It's about working collaboratively on identifying the needs for an area. And I think there's some really good examples of that collaborative planning work. If you look at Illawarra, Shoalhaven, and their affordable roundtable, I think there's a good case study there for how government and community housing providers can work together. Councils also need to realise that the cumulative impacts of housing requirements on the feasibility of affordable housing. Some councils are looking at changing some of the density requirements and car parking requirements to assist that provision of affordable housing. And I think that's to be encouraged. But I think it's not just about having the right plans in place. I think what's really important is implementation. And I think councils need to have the adequate resources to support their own plans and delivering them, to be able to be more proactive in looking at surplus land and working with community housing providers. I think and I think finally, just on that, increasingly councils are looking at how they can incentivise and support affordable housing supply, which is really, really important. And I would like to just say a little bit more about what options councils can have to support the supply of affordable housing in their areas. Let's remember that we're providing housing at below market. So the rents that we're charging is below the market. So the cost of construction and land mean that none of these schemes would stack up. They're financially not feasible unless there's some form of subsidy introduced. Whether or not that is a capital subsidy, a land subsidy, or sort of reducing some of the costs of actually building the properties in the first instance, all of that works. And I think there's good examples of where that collaboration between CHPs, council, government, where through collaborative approaches, these schemes are actually able to be financially possible. The private market isn't a solution for these cohorts. That's self-evident from the lack of supply. Currently, there's 50,000 people on the waiting list, and there's a projected shortage of over 200,000 in the coming 10 years. So we've got to look collaboratively at solutions. It's not one part of government and it's not one type of organisation that can make these type of developments work. I think one of the things I would encourage us all to consider is for not-for-profit community housing providers who are developing affordable housing to be exempt from some of the local development contributions. That could make a real difference between a scheme that's feasible and one that's not. I also think councils are increasingly looking towards introducing development contribution schemes, and I would encourage every council to really be considering that now. And if you look at other parts of the country where that's worked, so you've got in South Australia, they introduced in 2007 the Affordable Housing Action Plan, which while not strictly an inclusionary zoning scheme, it does require that at least 20% of all new estates include affordable housing. ACT is similar. They've introduced similar schemes and it's had a real impact. In New South Wales, since 2005, the focus has been on a voluntary provision to incentivise affordable housing. And to this end, a suite of measures have been progressively introduced. Voluntary planning agreements, which I think were introduced under the state planning legislation, can be negotiated when plans are amended or developments are assessed. And at the time of the introduction, the voluntary agreements were seen to be an alternative to the mandatory inclusionary zoning requirements. The voluntary approach was extended in 2009 with the introduction of the State Environmental Planning Policy for Affordable Rental Housing, which introduced a density bonus, as you know, for affordable housing, as well as planning concessions to enable more affordable forms of market housing, including boarding houses and secondary dwellings. All of that makes a contribution. And now I'd like to look at some collaboration and action. So from Housing Plus's experience operating across the Central and Far West, we develop our housing needs analysis for each LGA, and you'll see most of them on our website. So we as itself need to know what the housing demand is in those areas, but we also find that quite beneficial for some councils. We've worked with other councils in developing their affordable housing strategy. We've had discussions and are in discussions with councils to look at supply of land in their LGA, and that can be from subsidised through to full market value. And we're also looking with councils to see if they can relinquish some of those contributions to allow those schemes to become feasible. Again, we're encouraging councils to look at the SEP 70 because of the benefits that I've mentioned before. Turning now to the supply of more housing, Housing Plus was successful in 2018 to be selected as a social and affordable housing fund provider. And we're now building 280 new homes in the central and far west. That represents, I think, one of the largest regional social and affordable house building programs at this time. It's quite an innovative approach that the state has taken. It's a PPP type contract that beyond the construction of the properties, we are contracted to provide maintenance, management and wraparound support for 25 years for those tenants who live in those properties. It's 280 homes over 7 towns, so it's multiple sites that's been delivered on time, in fact, ahead of time. And what that represents by Housing Plus is an investment of $95 million into the regional economy in terms of jobs. And I was asked last year, the sort of height of COVID at that time, how many jobs was it creating? And at any one time, there's at least 300 tradies working on our sites. So the multiplier effect of housing and jobs can't be understated. And but it's not all about large schemes, and I'll go on to one in a moment, which is more of an infill development example. All of the houses that we're building are mixed tenure, so a mixture of social and affordable. They're tenure blind, so from outside you wouldn't know the difference, and they fit into their neighbourhood. They're all built to silver standard of the livable housing design guidelines, which allows tenants to age in place, as you know, and they're all at 7-star. In fact, more recently we're getting up to 7.5-star rating under the National House Energy Rating Scheme, reducing energy costs for our tenants. And that's with under a 1% increase in construction costs. So we're quite pleased about that. But it isn't just about the houses. I keep saying that community housing providers, one of their added values is the support that they provide to tenants. And that's no different under SAF. As I said, we have a dedicated support services team that works with the individual tenants to address their health, employment and education needs. And that will be the case for 25 years. And then just finally, just a small example of some other developments that we're doing in the region. As I said, we work with councils to try and identify land and opportunities. And we do that in the expectation that funding will become available. And we've entered into agreements with some shire councils to provide accommodation in their areas. And under the Community Housing Innovations Fund that was released last year, we were able to secure funding for that. And at the moment, we're just about, and will over the next 18 months, deliver 12 new houses in 3 different LGAs. And that was on the basis of working with the council, identifying the land, identifying the need, and being ready, that old cliche, shovel-ready site, ready for the funding. And as the funding is available, we're able to put forward a successful tender, contributing our own investment to supplement that of government. So that's a snapshot of some of the collaboration that I think can work and does work in practice, whether or not that's working on strategies and plans and identifying need, or actually building houses on the ground. And can I just finish by thanking the RDAs for putting on such a great summit today. I've found it very, very informative, and we'll be following up quite a few people after today's meeting with contacting them. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, and it's great to know how useful that's been. I think we're beginning to build a really diversified, fascinating picture of all the aspects of the housing issue that we're facing, both the opportunities and the touch points, the crisis points. We're going to talk more about collaboration now. Our next 2 speakers are Brett Stonestreet, who is Griffith City Council's General Manager. He's been in the role since 2011 with over 40 years of experience in local government, and has spent a significant period of that time as the CEO, Group Manager and General Manager in Victoria, and here in New South Wales in Gunnedah, Cobar and Barraba. Brett has a Bachelor of Business degree in local government. And with him from Argyle Housing, Justin Nyholm, who's their Acting CEO Property and Asset Services Manager. Himself with 30 years experience in the building and civil construction and maintenance sectors with corporate, state and local government, and also the not-for-profit sectors. Justin's experience ranges from residential, industrial, public infrastructure and air transport facilities. And with Argyle, he's delivered a number of housing projects and worked closely with the New South Wales state government, councils and others to progress major social and affordable housing opportunities in regional areas. So please welcome Brett and Justin.
Thank you, Genevieve, for the introduction. Certainly, it's a great opportunity to present to you this afternoon, and in particular the partnership that we formed with Argyle Housing. Myself and Justin are going to do a bit of a tag team here. So we'll start the presentation and we'll chop between slides. Okay, thank you. Probably the term there that at the bottom of that first slide is let's work together. The important thing that we've certainly gained over the last 3 to 4 years since we've been working or thinking seriously about affordable housing is that no one sector in the community has got all the answers. So working together with Argyle, of course, but other levels of government and developers and the like is the secret to sort of getting some results for this. So I'll let Justin give some introduction about Argyle, even though they probably don't need any introduction.
Thanks, Brett. First of all, I'd like to pass on Wendy's apologies. She was quite keen to come along, but unfortunately was unable to. And after the minister's introduction this morning, I did text her and tell her what the minister said, and said no pressure. But anyway, like David and Housing Plus, we're a community housing provider. We operate from Campbelltown down through the Hume corridor, through the Southern Highlands, Goulburn, Canberra, Yass, Young, Griffith, Wagga. And we've had a fairly lengthy presence in the Riverina, being Wagga, Leeton and Griffith. And we have had a long association with Brett and Griffith Council, which has come to this, culminated in this project being delivered. I'd like to just quickly build on something, the explanation that David gave for affordable housing and social housing. Social housing is income-based, it's not market-based, and tenants generally pay about 25% of their income in rent up until what's deemed market, and that's what's known as former public housing. And then affordable housing is what I call affordable housing capital A and affordable housing small a. Capital A is a product delivered by organisations like Housing Plus and Argyle, where it's no more than 75 to 80% of market rent, and tenants need to qualify. Now, interestingly, and a lot of people may not know this, as a single earning $61,000 a year, you can actually qualify for affordable housing, and that increases to almost $165,000 a year for a household with a couple and 4 children, and those limits go up to $76,000 and $205,000 if they're ongoing tenants. So the product's actually available to a lot more people than a lot of people realise, and we often find as an industry when we advertise for tenants, there's a lack of understanding of what affordable housing capital A is. What I call affordable housing small a is housing that is affordable, and be that private rentals or private ownership. And the reason I make that point is the project we're doing with Griffith Council with the federal funding in it provides both affordable housing capital A and housing that is affordable. Like David's organisation, we're not just landlords, we work in partnerships with support agencies and the likes to help people sustain their tenancies. Obviously, a lot of people find themselves in social housing because of tragedy or difficult circumstances, and they often need that support to get through. And that can be challenging, but rewarding at the same time. But I'll hand back to Brett to talk more specifically about the project we're doing in Griffith and how we got there.
Thanks, Justin. So just quickly, a bit of background to the genesis, I suppose, for the housing strategy. It was 3 years ago, I suppose, that Griffith considered that there was a real nexus between our economic growth and the capacity for the city to provide some housing to springboard that economic growth to the future. The housing strategy was adopted in 2019. We've got some really solid economic activity happening in the community. There's a lot of jobs growth. Our unemployment rate is well below the state average at around 3.3%. That's as of March this year. And so we needed something to address the affordable housing question. With the strategy itself, as I mentioned, affordable housing and economic growth, the nexus between those two terms is something that's really driven the council to bring forward some strategies. And we would have to say that our focus has been on affordable housing rather than on social. That is not to dismiss the need for social housing, of course. We have made a conscious decision that we will assist the community and other agencies advocate for social housing. But the focus for us is on affordable housing. In other words, for members of the community that are essentially gainfully employed, but are in that very low income level. We have a very much a shortage of 1 and 2 bedroom strata dwellings. We're going to need 1,700 or more dwellings in our community to sustain our economic growth by 2036. Our rental values have certainly gone up a lot. It was mentioned by the previous speaker, or several speakers today, the very low rental vacancy rates in our community, and our focus is on the low income earners. We adopted a new residential development control plan, which encourages a diversity of affordable housing. We've put some concessions in place in that DCP, especially some concession in relation to ground floor open space on ground floors, the number of car parks per resident living in the facilities, removal of height restrictions. Granny flats has been mentioned today. We've exempted granny flats from what we call Section 4 contributions, which is our water and sewerage taxes, essentially. Granny flats are exempt from that to drive that affordable housing. We have a development contributions concession policy for Section 7.11 and 7.12. So those developments that comply with those guidelines, they essentially get the development free of those charges. We're encouraging rezoning proposals for residential flats, and we've also recently approved a DA for 129 manufactured housing estate development. Probably then directly in the direct action front, we have donated a block of land to Argyle Community Housing for them to construct some affordable housing units, and then our Griffith Green project, which is the one that we want to talk a bit of detail about. So links to the Argyle, I suppose, Argyle Housing and the Griffith Housing Strategy. Argyle have been involved in this project well before the Griffith Green development was thought about, but certainly this question of partnerships was really important. Council is in the business of certainly regulating development and encouraging economic growth, but we don't know how to build houses. We don't know how to connect with the community in terms of housing, but Argyle do. And so we went about identifying suitable blocks of land in the city. So you can see on the screen there's probably 10 or 15 suitable sites that we looked at. But after sort of narrowing it down, we came up with our site at the Pioneer area, which is essentially the site for our what we call our Griffith Green development. So on the screen there, you can see our Griffith Green development there's a shared funding model here. It's a $12 million project. We received $6 million through the Building Better Regions program at the federal level. Council's contributing $3 million via contributing the infrastructure on the ground, the civil infrastructure. And Argyle, of course, our partners, are contributing $3 million in cash as well. And can I compliment Minister Pavey? Minister Pavey mentioned this morning that she means business in terms of working with communities, and she certainly did with us. And she facilitated Council and Argyle acquiring land from New South Wales government to make this project happen. We'll be building 20 affordable dwellings as part of the project. They will be held as rental dwellings into the medium to long term. There'll also be 42 build-ready lots that will be constructed, and Argyle will work with those 42 build-ready lots to then have a mix of developments, but certainly focused around affordable housing and various ownership rental arrangements. I might hand back over to Justin to kick on with the next couple of slides. Thanks, Justin. You need to unmute, mate.
And we're going for a fairly modern product where we can, but we're also trying, we are actually dropping this development in the middle of a fairly high social housing concentration. And we're mindful that we'd like to try and change the built form a bit, but not be too dramatic. And we've actually lobbied the minister to try and not just redevelop the section of land that we've bought from her, but rather to try and redevelop the rest of the what's known as Pioneer Estate. But anyway, she said one step at a time, and that's fair enough. So Brett, we might just go to the next slide. Thanks. So look, what's the legacy coming out of this Building Better Regions project once it's complete? So there will be 20 affordable townhouses, which we just saw. They'll be owned by Argyle and they'll be rented out as affordable housing capital A, at 75 to 80% of the market rent. And they will be targeted at those workers in Griffith that are struggling to get housing, be that health and emergency services workers, teachers, workers working in manufacturing. This is a project about addressing a shortage of infrastructure, and that infrastructure is housing. As I said earlier, the project is a mix of affordable housing and housing that's affordable, and that is the provision of approximately 42 building sites in the next stage, which is the bit we're going to move those on. I'll talk about those a bit more on the next slide, but they're not intended to be retained by council or Argyle, but rather made available to suitable applicants to move into housing. This is not just a housing project. We need to link in with support services for the tenants, and not necessarily just the tenants that will move into our development, but the tenants in the surrounding community, be that employment services, disability support services, etc. This is a supported housing model for everyone to help them move along that housing continuum. You would have seen in the master plan slide, we're going to develop some new and enhanced open space and some equipment. Certainly the open space area is reduced from where it was, but it is a far more enhanced and developed open space than existed previously. And we're hoping that this helps connect the community a bit better. There was some resistance or some hesitation from sections of the community to use that open space because maybe there were some undesirable elements in there. Mm-hmm. I think what's really important to note here is the partnership between a not-for-profit, a local government and a state government. The minister supported our project from the get-go, as Brett said, in providing the land. So when we put the BBR application in, we weren't wondering if we could go ahead. We knew we could go ahead. You know, the minister followed appropriate process, followed the Act, but she was very supportive of this project from the beginning. And as you can see, it's a $12 million project in a partnership with council and a not-for-profit. Obviously, there's $6 million of federal money in there that makes it work a lot better. But at the end of the day, council aren't asking for anything back for their contribution other than the provision of essential housing for workers in their town so the town can grow. And another thing that the project's targeting is a minimum of 10% Aboriginal housing, be that both in the 20 affordable rentals and in the 42 sites where we're looking at home ownership. This is something that the minister proposed in the acquisition of the land, and both council and Argyle agreed to. So we're actually partnering with the local Aboriginal Land Council to try and make that happen. Thanks, Brett. Next slide. The home ownership, and this is a complex one, and one where we haven't landed on the detail yet, but we need to. This is the 42 lots, and this is where we want to move people into home ownership. What we don't wish to do is to develop these 42 lots, subdivide them, have them fully serviced, and then have them sit there and not have houses go on them, not have couples, singles and families move into them, and not achieve, if that happens, we don't, not only do we not provide housing, which is much needed, we don't provide the social outcomes and the vibrant community that we're hoping to there in Griffith Green. So whilst there will be an application and selection process for appropriate people to move into those properties, to acquire those properties, be that on a shared equity or a buy to rent, be that on potentially a restriction on title where they must keep it for at least 5 years, etc. And we're working through that detail with council and some other providers. But most importantly, we want to see the housing built on those sites, and whether or not Argyle choose to build those houses and then sell them as house and land packages, or whether or not we sell those lots with restrictions on them. But they will certainly, they won't just be made available for someone to come in and profit from, unless, of course, we don't mind people profiting from them, as long as they're delivering the objectives that we need, ourselves and council need delivered on that site. It is a mixed tenure development, and we, David spoke before about mixed tenure. Another term that's often used in our industry more and more is about being tenure blind. And good modern developments, you can't pick the difference between the social housing, the affordable housing, the private rental and the private ownership. And that's very important to us in this development. As I said before, there'll be significant support services fed in to make sure this is successful. And it's about providing a thriving community, a vibrant community, but housing workers, so people live in Griffith, work in Griffith and make their futures in Griffith. I'll hand back to you, Brett, to talk about the partnership in the first instance.
Thanks, Justin. And this is the last slide that we have. In terms of lessons learned from the partnership, certainly that driver of our continued economic growth for the city, unless it's been spoken many times today with various speakers, unless we all get together and solve or at least work towards provision of additional housing, that's going to be a handbrake on us all. So that's an important lesson for us to get that stock up. Keeping the community informed, we certainly did as best we could in the early stages of Griffith Green, but certainly we didn't get it all right the first time. In future developments, we need to make sure that we're informing the community every step of the way, because there is uncertainty out there as to the intentions, what will their communities look like after the event. Justin did mention about the perception of loss of open space in the Pioneer area post the development. We sort of need to talk up a little bit more about the quality of the open space that will be resulted at the end of the development, which it certainly will be. That's something that's very important. Probably Justin, the last 3 dots, if you want to cover those off.
Well, thanks, Brett. We were surprised, probably, both ourselves and council, at the resistance we received from some sections of the local community. There were some sections that prized the open space that existed, even though it was rather undeveloped and not necessarily a desirable place for families to be in. But notwithstanding, we undertook extensive community consultation, and as a result, we modified fairly significantly the master plan, the open space and the connectivity. I remember a fairly tense phone conference with Brett one afternoon saying, we need to change this because this is what the community want. And we all very quickly realised that it was actually the right thing to do, delay the project by a few weeks, but we think we've got a much better outcome with the way we've laid it out. And whilst we're removing a basketball court, we are going to relocate that basketball court, and it's going to be adjacent to a community hub that we're proposing to develop on the eastern side of the open space and the eastern side of the development. And that community hub and Argyle will move in there. So it's not just a community space, it'll actually be Argyle's base of operations out of Griffith, and it will be connected to the open space and the basketball court. And that's where we really want to try and connect not just the people that are moving into the community as part of the project, but the broader community that surrounds it.
Right, thanks, Justin.
Brett, back to you.
That brings us to the end. I'll just stop sharing. Thanks, Genevieve. That's our presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Brett and Justin. Really interesting to see the benefits of that long-term, close, thoughtful collaboration and what that can bring to a community project, which sounds really significant. We're up to the final presentation of this session, and it comes from Jenni Mattila from Civitas. Civitas Solutions Australia assists local government and their local communities to establish owner-occupied housing cooperatives around Australia. So again, with the theme of challenging the norm, of looking for flexible, adaptive solutions to the pressures that we're discovering in regional Australia. Civitas works with local governments, banks and housing cooperatives to assist with finance for affordable housing, and not just in the major cities, but also in regional Australia, where quality housing is in short supply. So Jenni's going to wrap up Session 4 on future outlooks and challenging the norm by talking to us about financing regional housing. We'll then have time for some questions. Thanks, Jenni.
Hi. As we said, my name is Jenni Mattila and I'm from Civitas Solutions. My colleague Fraser Neal is also keeping an eye on some questions so that we don't miss anything. I'd like to thank Auntie Cheryl Penrith this morning for welcoming us to Wiradjuri country. And I begin today by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the country. That's the country that I'm on. They're the traditional custodians of the land, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and also to the young leaders in our Indigenous community. And I particularly wish to pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that we have here today. We've been listening this morning to the other presentations and particularly some of the councils and RDAs who are concerned that they're having difficulty getting property developers to develop land in their area, and also trying to encourage investors. And what Civitas does, which is different to what other people are doing who'd given the early presentations, is we assist those councils where it's just not practical for property developers and investors to be doing developments in parts of their local government area. Civitas is based in Sydney. We're in lockdown at the moment, but we work right around Australia, and I think we've basically done things from Western Australia to New South Wales to Queensland and so on. So we tend to move around a lot when we're not in lockdown. So some of you might have heard the presentation that we gave for the Regional Australia Conference in March, but today we've got a little bit more time and we can talk about some things in more detail. So we'll just run a brief animation which gives a little bit of an idea as to what it is that we do.
The Civitas model, an innovative, affordable housing solution for regional councils. Why do people move out of big cities? It currently takes twice as long to pay off an average house on an average wage in an Australian city. There are overcrowding, quality of life challenges, and long commutes to work. These are major push factors. As a result, many Australians are looking at living in regional cities and towns. Recent studies indicate that more than 400,000 people moved from Australian capital cities to regional areas over a 5-year period. The challenge for regional councils is ensuring this influx represents the right mix of new residents who can productively contribute to the local community. Communities need proximity to good schools, facilities for the aged or people with disabilities, easy access to shops and transport, and the workforce to service them. Civitas provides a targeted housing solution to attract the people required by your community. It can include a flexible mixture of low and medium density housing with associated ownership structures to best meet residents' needs. The Civitas model is based on international affordable housing research and supported by financial modelling. It takes into account Australia's current legislative and taxation framework, as well as the statutory and financial constraints facing all key stakeholders, including buyers. We work with councils to identify need, target residents, locate sites, and undertake a feasibility study. If the feasibility study demonstrates economic viability, Civitas will establish the ownership structure and facilitate the project financing. for the proposed residents of the new site.
So regional Australia has lots of opportunities for growth and expansion. This morning we heard that just in the Orana area that there's roughly $5 billion worth of infrastructure that is proposing to be built. Obviously the big ones, the inland rail, there's lots of proposals for dams, building and upgrading roads and bridges, spending on water and sewerage, funding for local government. There's lots of money being spent in regional areas. So there's lots and lots of initiatives for regional Australia, for regional Australia. There's business and employment initiatives that have been going on that have basically been supported by Regional Australia Institute. But with all of these things, government hasn't taken a holistic approach. So housing is the last thing they think of and the first thing that they need. Right. So there's three basic problems in the housing market. Existing housing is too cheap, so the bank cannot finance new construction. In some cases, it's too expensive, so people who already live there are being priced out of the market. The demand for housing may be too great, and so that causes a problem with price. So is it all about demand and supply? The difficulty that you have is that there's a number of push factors that are coming through from other areas, particularly because of COVID and very high housing costs in the cities. People are moving out of the cities and into regional areas. They're moving for lifestyle factors. They're moving because there's jobs growth in the communities. So we've been asked to focus on housing finance and the availability of finance, or the problems around finance for builders and homeowners, and why funding is such a problem, because it's not that property developers and investors aren't interested in investing in the regions. It's there as a serious problem with financing. So let's talk a little bit about price. As Kim said this morning, the demand for rental and owner-occupier housing exceeds supply. If it exceeds supply, then costs will rise. That's fairly straightforward. If there isn't enough demand for housing, the prices will fall, housing prices will stagnate, and housing prices in theory will drop. So that's sort of very simplified explanation. However, that's not all of it. There can be a problem because there's limited or no housing sites in the desirable areas. There could be a disaster risk. You could be in a bushfire zone or flooding. Probably one of the biggest costs is subdivision costs, because that runs to $50,000 to $70,000 in New South Wales per block for a subdivision before you even build anything. And then the other one, which we come across all the time, is that existing owners of land close to town may not feel confident in redeveloping their site, or so quite often there's available sites that are vacant or need to be redeveloped, but it just doesn't happen, and that's a very common one. So gaps in the regional housing market. The main streets are dying. Existing owners are often reluctant to move. There's a high demand for social housing, but there's a lack of regional support services and qualified staff, because qualified staff need somewhere to live as well. And the wrong housing is quite often in the wrong place. But the biggest problem of all that we have, which I've mentioned before, is that, and Kim mentioned it this morning, that there are valuation problems, and that's where the financing side of it really comes unstuck. The local cost of existing housing may be so low that you can't finance new subdivisions. The problem is often that the standard house in a lot of regional areas is about $250,000. But to build a new house, go through the subdivision process, the construction cost is often around the $400,000 mark. But if there isn't any new housing in the local area, what tends to happen is the banks are required under the APRA prudential standards to value to take their valuation based on the existing housing of $250,000. So that means that they can't lend sufficient funds to build a replacement house, 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom, exactly the same thing, for $400,000. So that means that there isn't the finance for the buyers. There is a problem with finance for the developers, and in one case that we saw, there was a problem where even it was just a single dwelling, and even though the person had a fairly significant deposit, the bank still wouldn't lend because of that valuation problem of there being no new housing, no comparables in the existing area. So one of the problems that you get is that government doesn't always understand the problem, which is why these seminars and conferences are so important in the housing market. I know with Fraser and I, we feel like we've been working on this for around about 4 or 5 years, and that there's a view that there's a quick fix. And that, the $25,000 housing grant, yep, that'll fix it. And you go, no, it doesn't fix it. That, okay, we'll give, you've got the stamp duty exemption the same as everybody else in the cities. No, we're really sorry, that's actually, you're not addressing the problem. But the housing in regional areas will only recover if where we have this particular problem with valuations, if there's a new model. Now, I should say that Mark Coulton, who was on this morning, and Nyholm actually do know what the problem is. But however, you still have to explain this to other ministers, to the state governments, so that they understand that what works in the city isn't necessarily going to work in the regions, that the problems are actually different. And because the problems are different, the solutions are also different. So the categories of regional housing where demand often exceeds supply is, as a number of the other speakers have said, we've got this really bad mismatch between the existing housing and what the current needs of the housing market actually are. There's a real lack of diversity. We really need medium density walk to the shops and services, as we've been saying earlier on today. We need diversified social housing. But one of the things with social housing where it's really important to be mindful is that you need to have the support services in place to meet the needs of those residents. What is very difficult is that you often get a very big demand for social housing. We need to be mindful if we bring in more people with high needs, we need to make sure that the state government, because it's mainly state government, is there to provide the services, to provide the healthcare services, to provide schools that meet the needs of that changing population. One of the other things that we'd come across recently is that if you're looking to encourage new people to move from the cities to your regional area, there's a big demand for lifestyle blocks. And in terms of zoning, that can be, you need to have a look at whether the demand is sufficient to actually adjust those bring in some lifestyle blocks opportunities. New South Wales local housing strategy. I'll just go through this very quickly. New South Wales government, for people outside New South Wales, and I know that there's some people from interstate who are watching, the New South Wales government requires all New South Wales council to have a local housing strategy. This is a really good initiative. If you're in one of the other states, one of the things that we found is particularly good and helpful is the New South Wales government template for housing strategies. So if you're not from New South Wales, definitely worth having a look at that. It's important for councils to understand the cause of the local housing issues and shortages. What is it exactly that's going on? So I thought the presentation this morning by Domain was really great. It gives you some data, very specific data, but some of the best people to talk to in terms of what are the issues, what are the needs, where have we got blind spots is the local real estate agents, because they'll know who's looking for housing, what type of housing they're looking for. Is it rental? Is it owner-occupier? Where are the gaps? Where are the houses? The accommodation is simply not available. Talk to the property owners in areas close to services. Are they interested in redeveloping? If not, why not? Because again, you have to have the land that's in an area where you walk to the shops and services. Now, if you're looking at medium density, you want medium density that's close to services. What's going to attract new residents and retain existing residents? What are the sorts of things that we can do? Talk to the builders. Can they get finance? Property developers are, compared to Sydney, relatively fewer and further between in the regional areas. Obviously, they're in some of the bigger towns like Dubbo and so on, but some of the smaller areas just don't have property developers, but they often have local builders. What is it that, what issues are the builders facing? And as I said, with the banks and the financiers, the APRA credit restrictions are basically why, with the best will in the world, on a standard model housing development, they actually can't lend. So you need to know what the issues are, and because we've been through this on a regular basis over the last few years, we've put together how you address those issues. So councils building a local housing strategy, just check that you've got staff, skills and resources to assess your existing housing stock. Does your local area have adequate services? Identify the gaps, what housing needs, what are the housing needs of the people in the local area, and what's going to attract new residents. I think the one thing that every council we've spoken to in the last 4 or 5 years have all said they need aged care workers. There's basic things like people need accommodation for teachers, for the police, for a broad range of key workers. So these are the sorts of things that we need to focus on. We need to identify and attract new businesses, and as I said, Regional Australia Institute does a wonderful job of that. And we need residents that will strengthen and support the local community. So it's really important to think through what are the services that you're going to need before you bring people in. Is the state government going to provide these services? Because that can be where things get difficult. So what we've found is that there's different options depending on which state and territory you're in. Western Australia has a wonderful program called Royalties for Regions. So they actually do quite a lot of funding through grant projects. That was mentioned briefly before when we had the terrible problems in Karratha in Western Australia, that grants from Royalties for Regions started to manage that issue. The WA government also does a form of shared ownership, which does have its problems, because what they've done is it's basically a tenants in common situation. People can own, say, 40 to 50% of a particular house, and the government will own the balance. But to get that to get the approval, you have to borrow from the Western Australian government, and the difficulty with that is that they don't actually lend at market rates. It's considerably above market rates, and you are not allowed to use a commercial banking arrangement. You have to use the WA government. It wouldn't be allowed in any other commercial situation. It's a problem with the ACCC, but it's quite an interesting situation. The South Australian government has got a really interesting government guarantee program that's worth having a look at if you're from some of the other states. I know that Kim mentioned this morning about unit trusts, but the big problem with unit trusts, and we've looked at them because we often get asked to sort them out, is that if you buy into a unit trust for housing, you don't actually own the land. It's not a strata title. It's not. It's not freehold. All you own is the units in the unit trust that give you the right of occupancy. So the difficulty with that is that the banks won't lend on the security of units in a unit trust for housing. So most of those people basically have to have the cash to buy the accommodation, and for most people that we're looking at, that's really not feasible. We come across a lot of problem with older women where they've got a deposit and they want to own their own housing, but they don't actually have regular income to be able to afford to pay a mortgage. So they've got a deposit, but not enough for the to pay for the accommodation in full, and they can't get a mortgage. Lobbyists tend to work really hard in the social and capital A for affordable rental housing, but there is no lobby group that actually looks after people who are wanting to be owner-occupiers. There's people who look after builders and property developers and social and affordable capital A housing, but there's no lobby group for young people or older people who are locked out of the housing market and are looking for a way in. There just isn't anybody. I've been quite fascinated, and I'll be interested to see how it goes, because I'm sure we'll all be watching with a great deal of interest. But Gerry Harvey, as we know, is looking to develop a high-rise in Dubbo, 13 stories, $35 million, 72 apartments. I'm assuming he's funding it off his balance sheet because, like everyone else, he would have difficulty getting funding because the apartments would have to sell at significantly above the existing housing price in Dubbo. Even though there's a huge demand, you still get that mismatch. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes, and because there really is a big demand in Dubbo that's not met. I know that it's going to be a lot of rentals, but I understand it's also meant to be owner-occupier. And so have I run out? I'm assuming that I've run out of time. I was having problems with my screen, so I do apologise.
That's okay, Jenny. Look, we are indeed getting to the point. We've got quite a lot of questions. So if you're okay for us to go to the questions,
yes,
yes, that would be great. And I'll invite David and Brett and Justin to participate as well. And a couple of comments. Graham says the issues you highlight, Jenny, are more applicable to inland and not to the coast, and the experience in the inland market is that we're too small for the banks to worry about. And another comment with regard to your presentation, Jenny, saying I think part of the financing problem, prices are growing too quickly and the banks don't have recent or enough data.
That's true.
But I've got a couple of other questions about the stigma of affordable housing, and I might perhaps go to Justin, to you first on this. I can see you there on the screen. Ella asks, how do we change the stigma of affordable housing to communicate the benefits and attract broader tenants? Do we need a broader, widely name change, for example?
I'm not sure we need a name change, but and I'm sure David will have some comments on this as well. I think we do need an education piece. And that's not just the broader community, that is probably with local government as well. You know, we operate across a lot of local government areas, and the understanding of social and affordable housing and the engagement on it varies greatly. And to be totally honest, the further we get away from Sydney, the better the understanding and the engagement is, to be totally honest. But I agree. I think an education piece is important. I don't think it needs a rebrand, but education would be very good.
Yeah, and David Fisher, I could go to you for your thoughts on that. And there's still something of a stigma around this, I think. And yet we've heard today how urgent this question is to enable regional economies to thrive. And that's the case no matter whether they're quite small, whether they're larger regional centres. But is there a problem about the affordable housing definition in the first place?
Well, I think the affordable housing definition can get used by different groups in different ways, and that doesn't help. As Justin mentioned before, around what he means by affordable housing, or what the community housing sector understands as affordable housing. Look, I think community housing providers can do more to promote what they're doing and promote the splendid work that they're doing in terms of new housing and services. But I would also just challenge that notion that there is a sort of widespread stigma, because from my experience of taking DAs through different LGAs, actually there's a lot of community support, enormous community support for more affordable housing, and most community members understand the need for a range of housing to be provided. So it's a good question, but it's maybe not the case in every LGA.
Just on that though, David Fisher, I've got a question too from one of our earlier speakers, from Tony Balding, to say, well, what is the definition of affordable housing? And I'm sure in the ACT, for example, it will be significantly different to regional New South Wales. And I certainly recall years ago as an ABC radio presenter in Charnwood, which is considered a very disadvantaged suburb in Canberra, the median house price at the time was $350,000. So it is a question of horses for courses, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it is. It is. And I think some of the messaging is better done at a local level or community level by councils and community housing providers. And I think, like the work that Argyle's done and with the council there, of working across the local community about what their needs are and bringing forward solutions that actually meet the needs of that community. I think that's the best way to, manage misunderstandings and any concerns that people have, that they realise that what's being brought forward is exactly what's needed, and generally that brings support.
Brett Stonestreet, I might bring you in there, and we've got lots of plaudits for what a terrific project it is that you've engineered along with Argyle. Will you need further affordable housing after the conclusion of this project? What's the likely sort of outcome into the future?
Certainly, Genevieve, there will need to be a lot more affordable housing. We think that this particular project could be upsized. We think that the benefits of this are going to be excellent for our community, and we're already thinking of the next stage down the track. And we have spoken with Minister Pavey in the past about the possibility of this being expanded into the future. I could just very quickly just make mention of this question of stigma, or if not, relating to the term of affordable housing. I think that development of that local housing strategy is a great process by which the community educates itself as to what's driving the need for housing and the impact it has on the economy, the livability of the community, and just the social fabric. During the process of preparing that documentation and having the community discussion and forums and the like, the community starts to get the equation. And for instance, my councillors, when this project was considered, there was not one comment against it at all. They got the message.
Which is actually very impressive, because perhaps more often we fear that will be the case, that there'll be dissension than there actually is. And it goes again back to the need for really thorough, really responsive community consultation, I guess. Tim Renwick from Push for the Bush says, great to see houses meeting the ALHG silver rating. Only the New South Wales government opposed this standard in 2022. Another question, I might just go back to you, Justin Nyholm. Could community housing providers share building design plans for areas that are under acute housing stress to help increase the supply at reduced costs for local construction?
Look, we could, I think, and that may have some benefit, but at the end of the day, I think it's also about engaging with good designers who understand the local environment and the local climate to come up with appropriate designs. I think the livability design guidelines are excellent. And I think some of the work the Department of Planning have done around medium density and giving some guides there is good. I'm not sure about our industry sharing plans, happy to, and we do. I guess one of the beauties of CHPs is we're generally not in competition with each other, and we do share a lot of stuff with each other anyway. Remembering there's copyright issues involved and all that sort of stuff as well. But yeah, I think, and by the way, Land and Housing Corp are doing some good work as well on design guidelines and working with the project home industry to come up with some good product that can be easily delivered, and then that can be repeated.
And Jenni Mattila, I might give the last question to you. How can community housing providers encourage and collaborate with local private investors in areas where communities have unmet needs for affordable and appropriate worker housing?
In our projects, we always, or we normally include a component for the CHPs because they're really good to work with in terms of having an understanding with the local communities. So, and the worker housing is also another aspect of it that we try and diversify the housing as much as we can. So there's a component for CHPs, but it's predominantly focused on owner-occupier because we find that that's the gap in the market.
Okay. And look, I think I've actually also been asked a number of times whether it's possible to get a copy of the questions that have been asked during the forum today, and I'll get our organisers, Rachel and Megan, to respond to that. Look, thank you very much indeed to our speakers from this last session. Garry Fielding has gone, but thank you very much to David, Brett, Justin and Jenni. Terrific to have you with us. I'm going to now endeavour to sum things up fairly concisely if I can before I hand over to Rachel and to Megan to conclude the forum today. We did start by saying that this was a knotty problem. Demographic changes, regional growth, employment demand and multiple other factors have collided to create a really stressful situation in a number of inland communities. And of course, we lay over that COVID and what it might mean for the long term. It's an interesting situation to find ourselves in. As Mark Colton pointed out at the beginning of the day, not long ago, communities were offering farmhouses for peppercorn rents. So desperate were we to get people into some areas of regional New South Wales. Now the focus is so strongly on people moving to the regions, so we need some innovative solutions. And Minister Marino is always one to argue strongly for a collective response across all levels of government, and that mateship and collaboration are very much in our DNA as regional Australians. So let's try to leverage that. It's particularly important when, as we've heard a number of times today, we've got a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure spend coming down the pipeline that will be of enormous benefit, but will also continue to put real pressure on housing. Minister Pavey also noted that this is essentially a positive issue in many respects, but one that requires flexible solutions. Among them, the New South Wales Government has identified and indexed all the Crown land that's available, all 250,000 parcels of it. And that includes land where zoning could be changed. We've listed the site where you can find that on the New South Wales Government site, and I think that will also be distributed. Really interesting data from Peter Gilman from Domain. COVID and housing have had this fascinating effect where the market remains extremely strong in many areas, and COVID could be a generational change for housing and regional community growth. It's not a flash in the pan. This is a real sea change in housing pressures in inland New South Wales, particularly because current workforce trends are really enabling dispersed work patterns. And that's not just the high-profile coastal destinations, but also the major regional centres. I loved her phrase that rivers outrank beaches, which is good news for many of us. And that in-depth data she was able to access about who's moving where and why and from where, data that many of you identified as very valuable. Neil Barber pointed out the positive economic influence of migration, and that migration to the regions is not disconnected from urban migration patterns. Much regional migration is still temporary, but there are ways to harness it for regional benefit. Large migration clusters in major cities do stress services, so there's a push to bring migrants into regional areas and to keep them there. That's problematic in some ways. There's a risk of exploitation with some private rental arrangements, particularly given it can be very tough for refugees and migrants to access employment. But there's an opportunity for some lateral thinking around incentives if we can work together across government and private providers to meet their needs, and to acknowledge that for migrants and refugees, smaller communities, places like Temora and Leighton and Walla Walla and Corowa could be quite appealing for some families in that cohort. Julie Briggs also talked to us about a flexible local approach to solving these problems, and it is really stressful. It was astonishing to hear that there's not a single house to rent in West Wyalong, down the road from where I grew up. And with that billions of dollars of infrastructure investment on its way, the lack of housing can be a handbrake on growth. So how do we unlock land that's zoned for housing but not being developed? Julie suggested possibly a revolving infrastructure fund that recognised the upfront costs of things like water and electricity and sewerage is enormous. It's got a long lead time. So could the state work via local government with developers and repayments would be made as sales are made, or also perhaps delay upfront payments like biodiversity offsets as a possibility. Kim Houghton talked to us about some of the key economic drivers in this situation: pent-up demand, regional growth driven by prices that were originally significantly lower than the urban centres, demographic trends that are bringing cashed up urban people to the regions and putting pressure on the locals. And he said, importantly, that many more people are choosing to stay in the regions, and that's driving historically low availability in many areas, well below the long-term average. Rentals are tied up for new arrivals, locals can't get in. There is, on the positive side, a record level of building approvals, although we don't have good data on what investors are doing in the regions. It'll all take time to flow through and mend that supply issue. But Kim warned us that population predictions have often been on the low side, so we need to just be conscious of those growth scenarios, particularly in the larger centres. Session 2 was on ideas and solutions. Mike Day talked to us about the art of timeless town planning and the neighbourhood unit. He seeded the idea of affordable living versus affordable housing and pointed out that well-designed neighbourhoods can actually be cheaper to live in. They reduce transport costs, they reduce heating costs. It's quite old-fashioned thinking in many ways about what makes people feel comfortable and connected and at home. Really simple things: the north-facing courtyards, good street frontages, pleasant, well-designed spaces, even if they're small, walkable neighbourhoods. Brendan Grills also gave us a really powerful presentation on housing pressures and warned us about what had happened in the Pilbara with that massive mining-led growth as a template for what we're experiencing and perhaps what we need to avoid. So social housing models might be well established, but where do we go beyond that for workers? How do we avoid those damaging boom and bust cycles for service workers? And the answer in the Pilbara was the service worker housing program, where rents could be managed separate to the market. And we got to this notion of the lifestyle villages, not a concept you might have imagined coming from the mines of the Pilbara. But Brendan made the powerful point that the market wasn't normal. And when that happens, it doesn't attract normal levels of investment. So it requires robust policy approaches to ensure that we don't lose service workers via a completely unfettered housing market. And Peter Vlatko brought us his real life experience of that in Cobar. The remarkable notion that mines don't necessarily engage themselves in these growth issues. They want the people, but they're not so invested in ensuring that they remain in communities. He pointed to difficult social issues, whether miners are welcomed, whether they become part of the community's social and economic structure. And if miners are flying in or flying out or bussing in or bussing out, that doesn't happen. So local government needs to work really hard to try to bring those people into the community without developing mining camps. In our innovation session, we talked to Tom O'Day from the NBM, who talked to us about digital infrastructure, now recognised as critical as roads and water. The potential upgrade paths are evolving constantly, including the Sky Muster satellite. And again, we heard about a huge amount of network investment, $4.5 billion worth of it coming to enable more Australians to access higher speed. He says 75% of people in fixed line networks should be able to do so. I'm always a little dubious about that. Call me a cynic, but I'm a farmer's wife, and I hope that that's what happens. And certainly it becomes a necessity. We could all have an average of up to 30 connected devices in our homes in the next decade. So it's critical for business, but a strong personal expectation for building regional communities. Nick Lane told us that it takes around 3 years for people to fully settle into their new communities. And he pointed to the need for available transition housing so that people who do come to the regions can build relationships and decide to stay. It takes a long time, he said, to meet the rising demand, but coupled with that is a sustained infrastructure boom that gives us huge opportunities for social and economic uplift. Riverina alone has many, many millions of dollars in the infrastructure pipeline with more than 7,000 jobs attached to it. And that needs capacity. There need to be workers to build everything that's associated with that infrastructure. If we're without the capacity, we miss out on opportunities. We create stressful and difficult situations for the existing workforce. and reminding ourselves that existing regional populations are ageing. So let's not repeat the mining boom issues that are so well outlined by Brendan and Peter. We need housing to be a critical factor in the planning process as the boom gathers speed. Catherine Brazier talked to us about efficient, environmentally sustainable opportunities for well-designed prefabricated homes, not what you would have thought of in the past. They grew out of the 50s and 60s housing crisis, but perceptions are beginning to change. We're talking construction on steel frames with double glazing, insulation, so much more attractive as an option. And it also responds to the skill shortage we've been hearing about. It's a small part of the construction industry, but growing fast with plenty of opportunities for not just houses, but also other sustainable buildings and facilities for communities. And we also heard from Tony Balding about the possibilities for resilient housing that meets particular needs, but is well made and it's efficient, particularly for people who've been through disasters. He mentioned an 8-hour install with Building Pros methods for a house plus a granny flat, painters inside within weeks. The capacity for adaptation to extreme fire zones, meeting insurance requirements, and that in turn makes refinancing and rebuilding more possible. Our final session was Challenging the Norm. We started with Garry Feilding, who talked to us about the search for solutions within the New South Wales planning system, including identifying the issues and trends in regional communities, the active search for solutions for greater housing choice, supply and affordability are being identified in regional New South Wales. We expect that report in October this year. But Garry said the impact of very little rental availability is abundantly clear in many regional areas. Housing stress and the following on pressures are growing rapidly, and that includes social pressures too. Where do you find social housing, for example? Where do you find crisis accommodation in this demand-heavy market, especially when the pipeline is slow to respond? And added to this, there is the issue around the stock itself. Is unlocking new sites always the answer? Not necessarily. David Fisher also stressed to us just recently how difficult this all becomes when there are 1.4 million people in some form of housing stress right now. And by affordable housing, we mean housing 20% below the market average. Where then do we put people who need refuge, people who need emergency accommodation, Aboriginal community housing providers and the like? He pointed out that community housing providers are charitable, they don't pay GST or land tax, or stamp duty, so collaborating with them regarding community housing makes it possible to achieve good solutions for your community efficiently and effectively. Now, it won't be the only solution. There are 50,000 people on the waiting list and growing. Nothing will be solved by a single agency, but that collaboration with community housing providers does mean that there are economic benefits, and that's in construction, in securing workforce, in all the issues that we've been talking about. You heard from Brett Stonestreet and Justin Nyholm about how effective those collaborative approaches can be, and also the lessons learned, among them the need for really extensive community consultation, understanding what the community values, which might be unexpected, perhaps not what you would have thought it would be, but we also saw the picture of what long-term close collaboration can achieve. And from Jenni Mattila just now, that it does take time, that fast grants and quick political solutions won't budge deep-seated complex housing issues. So just to summarise, there are both big pressures and big opportunities ahead for us in inland New South Wales. A huge infrastructure pipeline, a skills and labour shortage in the regions, which promise so many good things for our continued economic sustainability. But how and where do we support that with appropriate housing? And that housing needs to be well built. It should be responsive to people's real needs. It should be connected with how they want to live and work. There's a big demographic shift going on that those of us in the bush and the regions find ourselves right in the middle of. So let's get that right. Let's not turn regional inland New South Wales into another Pilbara. Let's ensure that housing is a critical factor in the planning process, that local stakeholders are always part of the process, but that government at all levels recognises that they also have a responsibility to participate actively, collaboratively, flexibly in these big issues. That warning about the Pilbara was an important one. Look, it's been a great pleasure for me to be with you to explore all of these fascinating issues about our own backyard. You're going to be emailed an event evaluation. Please complete that and tell RDA Orana and Riverina what you thought about today, what you've learned from it. I hope that you all carry forward many, many new ideas. Thank you for your time, and I'd like to now hand over to Rachel Whiting from Riverina RDA and Megan Dixon from Orana RDA.
Hello, everyone. Megan, are you coming on?
I am.
Excellent. Wow, what a day. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Over to you, Megan.
Yeah, I do agree. It's been an absolutely fabulous day, and thank you everyone for staying on with us. I'd also just like to start by acknowledging country and paying respects to elders present, past and future, and thank Auntie Cheryl for a warm welcome this morning. And today I come from you from the Brewarrina fish traps, which belong to the Whalan Nation. This is the 4th Inland Growth Summit that we've hosted, and I'd like to thank Rachel and RDA Riverina and her chair, Di, for approaching us to partner for this edition of the event. It was really well supported with 178 people registering for the event. It's super topical, obviously. And I think that we, with the support of some of our sponsors, managed to create an event that was very relevant and topical, and certainly provided some really good thought for the issue of housing across the region. The series was started as a way of putting a spotlight on our call for a policy differentiation for inland areas of regional Australia. You know, we recognise that while the issue of housing is being experienced everywhere, we think that in inland and in our small rural communities, the issues are much harder one to solve. But what was really good about today's session was that we actually heard some really good solves. And the presentation, you know, the last presentation in particular by Griffith and Argyle was a fantastic one. It's an issue that we did start to think about in some depth 4 years ago when we looked at the issues affecting labour supply in our region. So can't get people without homes. And it's something that we've actually just started to dig in much more deeply in partnership with our local governments. And the whole theme of actually working together and needing to do and look at this collaboratively, I think has been one that has definitely come through today. We've had some really good insights, discussions and questions today, and possibly had some myths busted as well. The issue of access to skills really wasn't today's topic, but it is a key one that we heard about. And I think Dr. Kim Horden was the first to voice the need for improved coordination between agencies and the pressure that we're seeing in the region caused by this great big pipeline of construction that's coming our way. It's not just government investment, but also coming out of the private sector who are responding to those opportunities. In that session, Kim also suggested the idea of, for our rural areas, and I'm just putting a spotlight on a couple of things that really stood out to me, but that idea of where we've got small volumes of building, the notion that we can aggregate with a regional housing trust. And it's something that I think that we'll look at for our region, and we'll have a conversation with Kim afterwards about how he sees that looking. One of the other highlights for me was Brendan Grillis's presentation and the spotlight that he put on the issue of needing to remain affordable, but affordable for workers and that service sector in particular. And it's something that we shouldn't lose sight of, because those people in our community are a segment that's really important to making our places livable. Each speaker, without a doubt, today gave us something to think about. The presentations will be, that are approved to be published, will be put up on the website next week, along with a series of videos from today, so you'll be able to watch them back. From our perspective, one of the things that we'll also be doing is shaping up a bit of a summary and position paper that we'll be using, so some of the insights from today, for a submission to both the Regional Housing Taskforce and to the Commonwealth Government, so that they're aware of what was discussed, some of the solutions and some of our recommendations that have come out of today. Thank you everyone for participating, and I'm going to throw back to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Megan. Well, RDAs are connectors, and when I went to Megan about this conference, it was all about making it easier to connect with everyone that needed to know this information. I know we've bombarded you with information today, but we felt it was important to connect you with as many people working in this space as possible. So I'd like to thank all the partners and sponsors that helped us to do that. Without them, we wouldn't have been able to bring you today, especially our local government partners, the Riverina JO and REROC, who've been with us from the beginning in the planning of this summit. Our comms partner NBN, they've made it possible for us to use Pyrus, Adam Bannister's fantastic business, to stream so easily to you all today. Our media sponsor, Region Media, and Genevieve being our fabulous MC. Her wrap up, I'm sure you'll all agree, was just extraordinary. And our session sponsors, HIA, Wagga Wagga City Council, Argyle Housing, and Committee for Wagga. Thank you so much for putting in that bit of funding that helps us just to make everything run smoothly. There will be a survey going out to you, and we would love you to fill it in. Thank you so much for all the positive comments we're getting in the questions screen, but we'd love you to fill in the survey as well, so that we can provide more fantastic presentations to you like today. And I'm glad that we've got in and finished within school hours for those who have to do pickups. So thank you everyone for today, and bye-bye.